Hello, and welcome to the National Book Festival. My name is Monica Valentine from the Library of Congress, and I'm here with Pam Muñoz Ryan, whose featured book at the festival is Manana Land. If you'd like to see Pam's presentation at the festival, log in to nationalbookfestival.com. You'll find it on the children's stage. Welcome, Pam. It's great to have you here. If you're ready, we can begin our conversation.
Great. Happy to be here. Hello, everybody.
Okay. So, Pam, your most recent book is Manana Land. What inspired you to write it?
Well, as I explained in the interview, I had an image of a boy walking near a stone arch bridge with his father and asking his father sort of impossible questions. How can I reach the horizon? Can I hold tomorrow in the palm of my hand? Those types of things. And I'm not sure how that image came to me, but the premise, the idea originally was for a picture book. But as I wrote it, it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the ideas sort of coalesced into, a novel, which became a longer novel.
Awesome. So we have a question from Emily here. Well, she has a question and a comment. First, she asks, how many times would you say that you rewrite a sentence or even a paragraph before you're 100% satisfied with it enough to move on? And then to comment, she says, I read Esperanza Rising when I was a teenager, and I have to say it is one of my favorite coming-of-age heroic stories. And I was so excited when I discovered that you would be featured in LOC's National Book Festival this year. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. That means a lot to me. As far as rewriting goes, today with computers, I don't obviously print every draft, or every time I finish a page or a chapter, I don't print it as much as I used to before computers. So it's very hard for me to say how many times. I would guess, first of all, I don't consider myself a writer. I consider myself a rewriter. I have that opening scene in mind, and I'll use this as an example. And I sit down to write, and I read. I write and I reread what I've written, and I change things, and then I keep going. And then the next day I go back to the beginning, and I read what I wrote, and I rewrite, and I write some more. And then the next day I go back to the beginning. So for me, writing is very recursive. I'm always returning to the beginning. Or as I move into the novel, farther into the novel, I'm moving 3 or 4 chapters back, and then I start reading and rewriting and reading and rewriting and moving along. So to say how many times a particular sentence might be rewritten, and then by the time it goes to my editor and copy editor, and we do those types of rewrites, maybe 50 times more. It's hard for me to put a number on it because it's really a constant flow of rewriting.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that bit of your process with us. Margaret has a question. She asks, what advice would you give to kids who want to be writers?
If you want to be a writer, I would say, first of all, I would say that you're much farther ahead than I was at your age. When I was your age, we didn't do things in school like you do. Curriculum was very different. We didn't write across the curriculum. We didn't have journals. We didn't have journals like my children have journals from when they were in kindergarten. We didn't have family literature night. We didn't have writing. We didn't make books at school. All of those types of things. I think I would have loved that. So when I see the type of writing that you already do, I'm a little bit jealous, because what I can say to you is that you're much farther ahead of me than I was at your age. I would say take anything in as you get into middle and high school and college. I take things that are writing related, yearbook, being in any of the dramatic arts, orchestra, band, plays, all of those things. A piece of music is a story arc in itself. So any of those things that nurture that sort of understanding the arc of a story or the arc of a piece of music, or especially plays. And so any of the dramatic arts, I would encourage you to become involved with them, even if they're just your elective. But I'd also encourage you to keep the writing that you have today and save it. I wish I would have saved, some of my earlier writings, just because it would number one, be meaningful and sentimental to me, but also because I think it would be really interesting for you to know, to see the sparks of creativity that you had at this particular age.
Okay, this leads nicely into the next couple of questions. Hannah asks, what course in your college education was the most impactful on your development as a writer?
I would have to say I took a course once called, my undergraduate work was in child and human development. And I took a course called Children's Literature in Childhood. And I still remember my teacher, and I remember how enthralled I was with the course and how fascinated I was. I always wanted to have a career that had something to do with books. I came from a very blue collar family, so and it had never really occurred to me to write books until I was a grown up. And so I would have to say that course really opened my eyes. And also when I was in college, I went back to school to get my master's degree. And when I went back to school to get my master's degree, one of my professors, who happened to be the same one that I took the undergraduate course from, asked me one time if I'd ever considered doing any professional writing. And until that moment in my life, I hadn't. And it was like she planted a seed that wouldn't stop growing. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility of writing my own stories.
Wow. Christy asks if you can tell us about something you failed at that made you a better writer.
Well, first of all, thank you, Christy. That's my favorite question. I was asked in a interview once, what do you wish students would ask you about that they don't usually? And my answer is failure, because what you see in a book is the tip of a very big iceberg. You see that the successes that I've had as far as the books that are published or the final book sits at the very tip of an iceberg of many, many starting overs, many frustrations, many abandoning a project, many proposing a project that never was accepted. So any of my success as a writer is the tip of an iceberg that is based on a lot of failure and challenges and starting overs and do-overs. And so I want you to know that that's part of my job. I mean, when you're dealing with anything creative, and there's many times I think of something as a great idea and I'm excited about it, and I might sit down and try to develop it, and then it just doesn't go anywhere. And then I have to just set it aside or put it in the file, and I have to move on. And so, but I can't look at it as a failure. I mean, I have to say to myself, okay, that was a challenge, and maybe it was just an exercise. But it certainly wasn't a success. So I just want you to know that that's just part of this job, is failing sometimes.
That's a great insight to share. Okay, now we have one of those questions from students, I believe. Yes, Doreen's third grade class would like to know what your favorite chapter book was when you were a kid.
Well, when I was that age, for chapter book age, my family had just moved across town, and I started riding my bike to a little tiny branch library that didn't have a lot of choices, but I did spend a lot of time reading the Little House books, the Boxcar Children books. Those were the types of things that my library had. I also read a lot of Marguerite Henry. Justin Morgan Had a Horse, those very early chapter books of Marguerite Henry. And so those are the things that I remember the most.
Okay. Wendy says, she has a comment and a question. On your author video, I love your message of hope, of rising beyond obstacles. Your titles, Esperanza Rising and In Manana Land, reflect that idea. As an author, do you see yourself as a guardian, one who helps others reach a different world, a new life?
Whoa, I'm trying to think if I see myself as a guardian. I think that's one of the wonderful things about being a writer, is that you can take on roles that you may or may not take on in your regular life. A writer's life, or at least for me, is pretty solitary. So most of what I do is by myself in my office, because I don't go into an office every day like maybe a teacher would, or if you go to work at a big library, you don't have that sort of collegial camaraderie that you might have with your coworkers all the time. So a lot of what I do is very solitary. But on the page, I can make life fair or more fair for my characters than maybe I'm actually able to do in real life. But that's my way of doing it. It's my way of having activism in my life, is to be able to portray these social issues and to have my characters struggle and cope with them. So as a writer, I sort of become an unlikely activist, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. Emily has a question about how long it takes you to finish writing. She says, how long does it take you to finish writing a novel if you are constantly rewriting?
Well, the other question there is, how do you know when to stop, right? So well, what happens is how long it takes, it just depends on the book. I mean, Echo took, it's almost a 600-page book, and it's actually 3 or 4 stories in one. That book took about 5 to 6 years. Manana Land took about, from the time I started it till it's published, took about 5 years, but it was done a year or so before it came out. So I would say 3 to 4 years, usually for a novel, just in a broad stroke saying that. And then if you're constantly rewriting, like I'm working with an editor. So my editor is keeping me focused. My editor is looking at the different drafts, giving me a lot of information, asking me a lot of questions. She's giving me information about how to stay on task, how to keep my story moving along in a very deliberate way. So I really pay attention to her wonderful comments and her wonderful direction. So you're working with an editor, and you also know what list the book will be on and how much you need to get done by a certain time. So that's also helpful to know when in the future the end will be. And of course, in the beginning of a story, the rewrites that I'm doing for my editor are very big and overarching, and it's moving of scenes and thinking about the plot and the themes that are in the book. But as it progresses, the editing gets tighter and tighter and tighter until it goes to copy edit, and you're talking about commas and page layout and things of that sort. So you pretty much know by then that it's very close to the end, and you don't really have the time to say much more. Did I lose you? Hello? I'm not sure if you guys can hear me. Can you hear me? Everything looks like it's on.
Difficulties at the second.
Okay. Let's see. Somebody's texting me. Oh, okay. You can hear me. Well, I will try to answer some of the questions that I see. I can't hear Monica anymore. She was the one feeding me the questions. Somebody asked, let's see. Oh, but the moderator is not. Okay, thank you. If another question pops up, I will answer it. So it says, thank you for your compliments about Esperanza Rising. What inspires you to write your books? Well, I get my ideas a lot of different ways. For instance, Esperanza Rising is based on a family story. Sometimes I get ideas, I'm doing research for one book and I come across information that I think, oh, wow, that would make a great book. I'm going to talk to my editor about that for maybe the next book. So very often one book leads to another book because of the research involved. Um, and so that's another way that I get ideas. But ideas are sort of like a confluence of rivers. A lot of times it's more than one thing coming together that will eventually become a book. So if somebody asks, do you feel like you won the lottery with your gorgeous book covers? Yes, I do. And I wish I could tell you that that I technically got to choose them. I get to weigh in, but my editor, Tracy Mack, and art directors, Maria Costa and David Saylor, um, you know, help. They search for somebody who has the particular style for one of my stories, and they propose people, and then we all agree. And I've just been very, very lucky. And yes, I'm very proud of the beautiful illustrators that I've been able to work with. So now I can't see any questions at all. Oh, is she based on you? I didn't see the first part of that question. Sorry, now I see no questions and I can't hear anyone.
Of Congress, how are you today? I'm going to jump in here and see if I can help.
Let me think. Switch to the published and answered tabs. Oh, how do you find a publisher? Did it take a long time to find one? I had a literary agent who had some early manuscripts. This was back 25 years ago, and she was the one that initially took my manuscripts to an editor at Scholastic. Yes. So I'm going to scroll down to some of the questions that thank you for your compliments about the books. It says, someone asked, as you wrote your new novel, did you plan a grid of characters, settings, possible plots? And do you plan your ending and then work backwards? Sort of yes and no. I usually know in that opening scene, I know the characters. And like, for instance, in Manana Land, I knew that Max and his father were in this scene that Max had all these unanswered questions, but I didn't know why. I still needed to figure all that out. But I also knew that Max and his father would have some sort of conflict and that in the end, there would be some sort of reunion. I didn't know what that was. So I had to ask myself a lot of questions, like what was it in his life that could be causing him conflict? I knew he was 12 years old. I knew he loved football. I had a few things about my character. So I began asking myself a lot of questions about his life, where he lived, and what issues in his life could be affecting his progress through a story. So in a sense, yes, I do use a huge whiteboard, and I have a big whiteboard behind me that 7 feet long, 4 feet high, and I do I always print out the calendar of the story that I'm working on. It's just blank months, and I
Hello, if you can hear me in the room, it seems that we're having some technical difficulties. We will go ahead and see if we can resolve and get Pam Muñoz Ryan back. Thank you, everyone. Please bear with us while we try to get Pam back. Thank you. Welcome back, Pam. My apologies.
Okay, no problem. I
We're
wanted to
having
make, I
some.
was hoping it wasn't on my end.
No, it seems like these things happen, but we're glad to have you back, and we still have a full room of individuals. My name is Jared, and I'm with the library as well, so I am happy to kind of jump in and help you with some questions.
Okay.
So I can go ahead and read from the chat and have, I guess
I'm
right now, we have from Kristen, our class wants to know what your childhood was like.
Well, I think it's one thing that contributed to my creativity in that I grew up during a time that is very different from today. I grew up during a time where I had big blocks of unchoreographed time. So I didn't have a lot of what maybe children have today. Like, Mondays you have violin lessons, or Tuesdays and Thursdays you have soccer and activities every day after school. It was just a different time when I went to elementary school, and so I would say that I had a very unchoreographed childhood where I was able to spend a lot of time with my own wandering thoughts. And also, I was the oldest of the three sisters, the oldest of the 23 grandchildren, the oldest girl in the neighborhood. So I just remember spending a lot of time doing dramatic play with all of my cousins and neighbors, and doing a lot of pretending. And so that's how I would explain my childhood.
Wonderful, thank you. Cynthia Lewis wants to know what is it that you like to read?
I like to read a lot of different things. Like sometimes I like to read nonfiction. Sometimes I like to read historical fiction. Sometimes I pick up. I like to read a lot of different types of magazines. I read heavily in the genre in which I write, meaning like between that fifth grade to ninth grade, I read a lot of books, especially the new books that I'm fortunate because my publisher will send me the new things on the list, and so I often read those. So I'm not just like, I don't just read dystopia or just read nonfiction. I'm really like to sample a lot of different things.
Wonderful, thank you. How do you approach researching your books? This is from Emily Corman.
Well, I have to say that libraries and research librarians, especially, are so generous. I spend a lot of time in libraries. I spend a lot of time going through over the years through archives, or going through old microfiche, or to see old articles. Um, Librarians are probably my biggest resource. I also spend a lot of time at historical societies if I'm writing historical fiction, and museums, and I just find that that the archivists are so helpful. They've compiled and curated all of this information about a particular place, and they're very excited when you come and you want to research, because that's what their job is for. So I would just say that archivists and librarians, and even just picking up the phone and calling a museum and I'll say I'm doing research on this particular thing, and I just find people to be incredibly helpful, and just for the asking.
Great, thank you. Julia would like to know, how do you choose your book titles?
Book titles, hardest thing. And the reason for that is the title of a book in the publishing house is something in which many people get to weigh in. So it's just not what my editor and I decide on that we like, and that other people need to weigh in too, like the entire editorial department and publicity and marketing and the sales department. And so many people look at the book and consider what their area of expertise is, and then they have comments to say about a particular title. Book clubs and book fairs can weigh in because they're also going to sell the title. And the booksellers, I mean, the sales reps who sell to the booksellers, they're going to have an opinion. So the title of a book is something in which many people get to weigh in, and it's just a long process of coming up with a lot of different titles until we can all agree on one. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Carrie and her 6th grade class would like to know what is your biggest inspiration for being a writer?
Well, I'm very, I don't, I'll say this, momentum is far more important than inspiration when it comes to writing. And what I mean by that is if I waited to be inspired, I'm not sure that I would ever get much done. And I really, first of all, I feel like I have the right temperament to be a writer. I don't have any problem spending days, weeks, months, sometimes on end, revisiting the manuscript every day, writing a draft, you know, and this is a very long process. But I think I have the right temperament for that. But I love books and I love reading and I love readers and librarians and publishers. The whole field is something that I embrace and I want to deliver for all of those people, including myself. So I think my inspiration comes from wanting to continue to participate and be a part of this culture of literacy. But as far as my daily inspiration to sit down and write, as I really approach it as a job, it's something that I love doing. It's not always easy. It's a lot of work, but I'm very I know that the motivation comes from revisiting the manuscript. So the momentum of writing is far more important than the inspiration of writing.
Great. Thank you very much. We have time for just about maybe 2 more questions. So I'm going to see if we can get them in here. What gave you the idea to write Esperanza Rising?
Well, many years ago, like 25 years ago, I had the idea to write a picture book about my grandmother and my grandmother crocheting and telling me a story about her childhood. And I submitted it as a picture book manuscript, and it was purchased by a different publisher as a picture book manuscript. And as so often happens in publishing, my editor left, another editor took over the book, and that editor, after a few months, left, and then another editor acquired the manuscript, but it wasn't really that person's cup of tea. And just to make a long story short, I eventually took the manuscript back. I started working at Scholastic with my editor, Tracy Mack, and we had already done Writing Freedom, and I believe Amelia and Eleanor Go for a Ride. We'd already done those 2 books together. And this sort of stepchild of a manuscript came up, and we began talking about it. And when she read it, she said, "I think you have a lot more to say here." And she said, "Would you consider again, writing it as a novel?" And that's a very simplified answer to kind of a big, complicated journey for that manuscript. But that's basically what happened.
Great. Talking about your momentum and the combination of inspiration and momentum, Emily would like to know, how long does it take for you to finish a novel if you are constantly rewriting?
Well, I think we already had that question before, but novels usually take about 3 to 4 years for the writing. Echo took longer. It took about 5 years.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I am going to ask our final question here.
Okay.
And our 5th grade from Christine wants to know when you finished your first book.
Oh, they want to know. I'm sorry. They want to know when I finished my first book.
Yeah, wants to know when you finished your first book.
Well, my first book in children's publishing was published in 1994. So picture books take a year to be illustrated, so probably in 1993, maybe 92. Yeah, it's been a while.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the room before I pass it
Well,
back
that's
to
all the questions.
Monica?
Yes, Monica, go ahead.
Well, that's all the questions we have time for today. Thank you so much for your patience through the technical difficulties. And thank you for sharing your time with us so generously today, Pam. We've been speaking with Pam Muñoz Ryan, whose latest book is Manana Land. You can find her presentation on the children's stage of the National Book Festival at nationalbookfestival.com. Thanks to our audience out there. And I hope that all of you will take the time to explore our mini programs and enjoy the remainder of the National Book Festival.